When you're watching combat sports, you're always expecting for a fight to live to the highest of expectations, but unfortunately, these 8 fights we're gonna discuss not only fell below expectations, but were just completely bad altogether. And I'm not talking about fights where it's a debate whether they were good or bad. No, we're talking about fights that were so bad that they have now become infamous. Today, we're gonna go over 8 fights that I think fit in this category. Now, to make this more interesting, we're gonna split it up. We're gonna do 4 for boxing and 4 for mixed martial arts. And to kick this list off, we're gonna go back to Bellator 149, where we had 2 street fighting legends ready to battle it out. Dada 5000 versus Kimbo Slice. Even though these two were professional fighters at this point, since they came from a street fighting background, you wouldn't expect the most technical fight in the world. You'd expect a straight up brawl to take place, but instead, we got one of the most lackluster MMA fights of all time. Both fighters looked completely gassed by the middle of the first round, and for the rest of the 3-round bouts, you were wondering if one was going to get a technical knockout by just straight up exhaustion. And that's exactly what happened.
Dada using the fence, staying on his feet somehow. Nothing behind those punches. Aliev is stand up. He steps in front of Kimbo, can't even get his hands up anymore. Kimbo gets out of his way, he's gonna fall. Dada has no idea where he is. And that's the ground.
But what's even crazier is that Dada 5000 for a brief moment was actually dead inside the ring as his heart stopped. While Kimbo Slice went on to win the fight, it was later determined that he took a banned substance, so this was later ruled a no contest. And sadly, a few months later, the street fighting legend would pass away due to congestive heart failure. One lackluster fight certainly doesn't overshadow the legacy Kimbo Slice left behind. Rest in peace to one of the greatest street fighters of all time. Next, we go to the world of boxing, where we have a heavyweight championship fight on our hands. Lennox Lewis versus Henry Akinwande for the WBC World Heavyweight Championship. Before the fight even began, boxing commentating legend Larry Merchant actually predicted what was going to happen.
Just how big a threat is Akinwande to Lewis?
Well, he might hug him to death, but he really is a threat.
Larry Merchant was almost perfect in his prediction. Akinwande sure did a lot of hugging, but he certainly wasn't a threat. From the opening bell, every time Lennox Lewis was in punching range, it felt like Akinwande immediately went for the clinch. It got so annoying early on that referee Mills Lane immediately warned him, "You gotta fight."
Don't you tell him, you do the fight, or I'm gonna chase you. And you can do better than that, you understand? Grab it, come on. Let's go.
Hard to imagine how much longer Lane can go without being forced to disqualify Akinwande.
Hey.
He's in an awful bad position.
Terrible.
Step back means step back. You tell him next time he's gone, okay? You tell him.
Hey, Henry, he's getting ready to disqualify you.
You need to fight.
Don't let him disqualify you. He's about to drop dead, man. All you gotta do is fight him. Fight him back.
Shocker, he kept doing the same thing, and towards the end of the 5th, Mills Lane called the fight, giving the win to Lennox Lewis. In those 5 rounds, Akinwande held Lewis over 50 times. But that was way more action-packed compared to the next fight we're going to talk about. For UFC 226, we had Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. 2 of the hardest punchers on the UFC roster at the time were set to duke it out in a heavyweight fight. What ended up taking place was record-setting for all of the wrong reasons. In total, the number of strikes landed was 31, making this the 2nd lowest ever in a 3-round UFC fight.
If you would have told me it would be 3 minutes into the first round and Ngannou had never even threw a shot, I would say you were crazy. Yeah. Look at all these people lighting their lighters up, using their phones. Yeah. People are upset. The guy was willing to exchange with anybody. Look at this, Herb Dean talking to him.
See, they're going to grab his back.
Guys, you guys need to engage. Don't get me involved. Make me take points from someone taking a back step. Do this on your own.
But it never picked up, and Derek Lewis, I guess, did enough in the judges' eyes somehow to secure the victory, leaving the crowd not only displeased, but even Joe Rogan had to call this the worst heavyweight fight he has ever seen.
That's one of the worst heavyweight fights I've ever seen in my life, if not the worst. No, I'm gonna say the worst. What was worse? Name a worse heavyweight fight.
Well, speaking of heavyweight fights that might have been worse, let's go back to the world of boxing. We have up-and-coming heavyweight contender Jorge Luis Gonzalez versus Ben Smith. While this fight didn't last past the first round, you'd expect a knockout punch to be the cause of that, right? Well, actually, quite the opposite. Smith just came out of the gate throwing these wild punches and ended up throwing himself out of the ring, basically.
Fighters, he wears the red trunks with the black trim. Big Ben Smith in the black trunks with the white stripe. And he comes out fighting like a wild man, and he rolls into the cheap seats. He's hanging on for dear life already, and he hasn't even been hit, Chuck. Not a good sign.
He's having a rather impromptu meeting with the commission. I wonder what they're telling him.
Well, they're looking over his license right now, and don't tell me he's claiming to be hurt. He's going to wave it off. Oh. I think the fans are going to be too happy with this performance.
Now, all right, he corrals him around the neck and throws him through the ring. I mean, Big Ben didn't even get clocked.
Ladies and gentlemen, the time, a John Unitas, 19 seconds of the first round.
Damn, even the ring announcer did a bit of trolling. While this fight didn't make it past the first round, the next one we're going to talk about didn't either. Aliev Mahmoud versus Kiyoshi Tamura had an MMA fight take place in Pride Fighting Championships 29. Right away, Mahmoud starts jumping all over the place. It's crazy, he just kept hopping like it was hot potato, eventually propelling his groin into one of his opponent's kicks.
He felt that one a little bit more than the previous shot, that's for sure.
During the 5-minute timeout, he actually called it quits, but nobody noticed, so they kept fighting. And then he tries to call it off again, still nobody notices, until it ended in a very awkward stare down. And then I guess the third time's a charm because he just waves his hands and calls it quits. But at least that fighter had way more skill compared to the next one we're gonna talk about. When Cedric Rose took on Edward Rackley, it was looking like another boxing match between two fighters who had recently turned professional. But instead, it was basically an amateur versus a professional. Let's see if you can tell which is which.
Round one, it is scheduled for 6, and while that may not sound like a very long bout, it is for a man who's fought all his career as an amateur and ended his first 2 professional fights before the end of the 3rd round, and that's what Cedric Rose did.
And we had Cedric on his second pro fight in one of those knockouts against not a great opposition, as it doesn't look like Rackley.
Oh dear. Rackley keeps on coming with those long arms. You talk about throwing a punch from Australia. He's throwing his from some other planet I don't know.
Edward Rackley is not the most stylish fighter we've ever seen here on ESPN. I think we can say that.
He's down again. That'll be the 2nd count, and that'll be enough for the referee, Dickie Cole. He has seen enough.
Even the ref is like, dude, what is this? What is going on? We've now arrived to the final MMA fight on this list between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock. This is actually a series of fights. The first time they met in UFC 1, Gracie forced Shamrock into a tap out. But when they met again for UFC 5, it would turn out to be the longest fight in UFC history. 36 minutes and 6 seconds. To sum up the fight in a nutshell, a bunch of comments from UFC's YouTube page where the fight is uploaded were basically saying they were just in the missionary position, because it really looks like it. This went on for 30 minutes until they had to call time, and this marked the first time the UFC had to put a time limit on a fight because nothing was happening until they let him do the same thing for another 6 minutes and called it a draw. But while it may look like they didn't do anything to some watching, the final boxing match we're going to discuss makes this MMA fight look like an all-time classic. John Real Casimero and Gilmore Rigondeaux fought for the WBO Bantamweight World title. This fight would end up being historic. once again for all the wrong reasons. Turns out these two barely touching gloves would be an omen, as this fight would set a CompuBox record for the least punches landed in a 12-round fight, with a total of 91. But at first, it wasn't looking like it was gonna be that way, as Casimero ended up getting a knockdown in the first round. But that would end up being the peak, because what followed not only was just a bunch of running and chasing one another, but also a little bit of trolling.
Between Jean-Real Casimero and Guillermo Rigondeaux. And a little bit of gamesmanship there by Rigondeaux. And again, Rigondeaux, they're pretty much walking around each other. Casimero says, are you going to fight or what? He literally stands straight up, squared himself up, and invited Rigondeaux to come to the center of the ring. And the boos echoing here at Dignity Health Sports Park, a venue that has been home to its fair share of toe-to-toe affairs. This is not one of those affairs. Well, Casimero no doubt has so much respect for Rigondeaux, and this is something you don't hear often at a place known as the War Grounds. Boos from a lack of activity between two prize fighters.
Casimero ended up retaining his bantamweight title in one of the most lackluster title fights you'll ever see. And that'll do it for this list of the 8 worst boxing/MMA matches. For all of the wrong reasons, these bouts will forever go down in the history books. There are thousands of fights that happen every year, so of course not every single one of them is going to turn out to be a banger, but we can only hope that they certainly don't turn out as bad as the fights we just went over. So the next time you watch a fight and you think, whoa, that was bad, make sure to check back on this list to confirm it. While those were terrible, it sure as hell beats some of these YouTuber fights that go on nowadays.
Oh, he's doing the old Anderson Silva.